Hey everybody, good morning. I know I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to keep this moving. My name is Anil, as mentioned. Some of you I may have tweeted at, or you tweeted at me, so if you want to follow up with me, please do reach out to me there. These days I am the CEO of a company called Glitch, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. What we say about Glitch is that it's a friendly community where everyone on the web can create the web. But I want to talk about why that's what I work on these days. And I'm going to take us back to a moment when the web was young, when the internet was a smaller place. And this is partially because this month for me is the 20th anniversary of me starting my blog, which makes me feel incredibly old. And also, I am certain there are old problematic things you'll find that you can go back and find in the archives over the last 20 years. But it put me in a reflective mood. It had me thinking about what it means to have been on social media and the social web for 20 years. To give you some context of what that was like, 20 years ago, December 99, we had a dinner in New York City, where I live, for bloggers. That was all it was called, bloggers. And we had everybody in New York City who had written a blog come to dinner, and we fit around 2 tables. And so I met the guy who had coined the word blog in September of 99. I met a guy, Joel Spolsky, who had made a tool, one of the early blogging tools. And so I met these folks that were creating this medium around us, and it was extraordinary. It felt really special. And then that ended up being what I did for several years. I helped build some of those early tools, and I saw the rest of the tools around us spring up. These were creative platforms on the web like LiveJournal, Black Planet, GeoCities, Neopets. Anybody ever make a page? Even MySpace? Anybody here ever make a site on these? Good, okay. So you younger folks, you can ask us less younger folks about what it was like back then, but you liked a band or you liked a movie that you saw, and you would just go online and share these things. And I wanted to offer a little bit of perspective into voices we don't often hear, because especially in a context where we're talking about startups, we hear these huge stories of the giant successes and typically a story of 1 or 2 founders who, well, we know what they look like, and we know what they act like, and we know where they're supposed to be from. And for those of us who don't fit that mold, we wonder, well, does that mean that I can't create something that matters? So I'm going to talk about the stories of innovators, of creators, who I am almost certain you don't know, but who shaped technology and shaped social media and shaped the world around us in a lot of ways. And I'm going to talk about an ethos that was present at those early days of the social web and of the web as it became today, where there was an expectation that we created things together, that we were going to riff off of each other's work, that we were going to learn from one another. So let me talk about some of these creators. And I want to try to do justice to these stories because you probably haven't heard them anywhere else. One of them is Brad Graham. So Brad actually was one of probably the first 10 people on social media in the world. He had a blog in 1998 called The Bradlands. And Brad, well, he did a lot of things. He was a theater manager, had a lot of things going on when he started this site. But one of the things that he realized in the late 90s was that he didn't see a lot of active voices for LGBT representation in this new area of social media. And so he organized people around a riff on what was then a common activist event on December 1st for World AIDS Day called A Day Without Art. And gay and queer activists for years had been shrouding statues and covering artworks as a sort of remembrance of all those lost to the AIDS epidemic. And he thought he would bring that same idea online to the new area of social media. And so he made A Day Without Blogs. And he launched that, I believe, in 1998 or 99. But what you see with Brad is from the very earliest days of social media, he had championed the idea that these were tools that could be used for activism, for organizing, for promoting actions and causes that we cared about, that it could connect artists, not just technologists, and that it could make people think and reflect. And Brad was also somebody who could kind of see the future in a lot of ways, and it was incredibly funny. He said, what's the worst possible name I could give to this new realm of social media, of blogs that are arising? And he coined the word blogosphere, literally saying this is so awful and repulsive, nobody would ever use this word unironically. One of the few things that he was wrong about is that word actually ended up being covered in media. But it planted the seeds for a lot of the activism to come in the years that followed. Similarly, Aaron Hawkins, his sort of seminal blog in the early 2000s was a way that he described himself. To be clear, this is not ever how I would describe Aaron, but this was his own words, the site called uppitynegro.com. And what Aaron really pioneered was the idea of challenging respectability politics, unabashedly talking about especially the issues of being a black man in America, and putting it out in his own voice, in his own words, in a way that was going to reframe the conversation from the sort of polite ways that people had been forced to talk about these issues. And it was a really, really powerful influence on the early days of social media, although not one that people quote or cite a lot these days when they talk about where these ideas come from. And then similarly, Leslie Harpold, she made lots of different sites. One of the most influential early ones was called Hoopla. And what she tended to make was sites where people could participate by building off of each other's work. They could use a template that she creates, and others could pick it up and make their own version of it, riff on it, respond to each other's work, and sort of make this sort of process of inclusion and creation, whether it was group creation of poetry, photo projects, other similar things. And it's something that I think really changed people's perception about how we respond to one another and set a lot of the precedent for people riffing on the same meme or joining in a hashtag and sharing their stories. That kind of narrative storytelling of people working together to tell a story all together in one connected narrative wasn't common in the late 90s on the web, and Leslie really helped pioneer it. And the reason that I talk about what these creators have done is because that feeling of the web sort of disappeared in the years that followed. It felt like everything sort of got narrowed down. The web got a little bit less weird. We ended up with basically a couple little blue icons that we tap on and we put our photos into, and that's what's supposed to feel like sharing and expressing ourselves. And the other reason I tell the story of these creators and that web that has sort of faded away is they're all gone now. They've all passed away in the years since. And I think a lot about the history that goes when we lose friends, when we lose innovators and pioneers, and how that shapes whose stories we hear. Which narratives do we hear at a conference like this about who are the founders we're supposed to emulate, who are the creators we're supposed to emulate? I also think about what happened to that medium that they helped shape in the years since they were gone. And the truth is, I feel like it got worse. We saw tools like social media as platforms for expression for the most underrepresented, for voices that weren't often heard. But some of those voices that then got heard were voices that didn't use that platform responsibly. They were amplifying misinformation. They were leading harassment campaigns. They were targeting the most vulnerable, not lifting them up. And speaking only for myself, I was too naive about that risk. I built these tools not thinking enough about, well, how do we make this community healthy? And worse, there was a feeling that social media, rather than becoming a way that we expressed ourselves, was a machine that we had to feed. Right? We had to get those likes, we had to get that engagement, we had to respond, we had to keep our streak going, we had to read the stories, right? There was a lot of anxiety being generated. And I think it's no coincidence that those changes happened at the same time as the makeup of the creators of these tools changed. When I started building social media tools 20 years ago, nearly every one of the companies that I either worked for or that got to collaborate with had co-founders who were women, had people of color who were in leadership positions from day one. It got less diverse, less inclusive, and more homogenous as more and more money came in and the platforms got more and more users. It's a story that I don't hear told often enough, but it is the truth about how these giant platforms were created. And then the business models themselves felt like they were based on surveillance and coercion. They were stealing data from us, doing creepy things, doing unexpected things with our data, and trying to compel us to engage more and more in ways that maybe didn't feel like what we wanted to do. They were showing us stories that weren't true. They were trying to get us to cajole our friends into keeping that streak going with us. It didn't feel like consent was an underpinning of either the business model or the interaction model of the tools around us. And then there's the worst of what came as the harms from social media. It doesn't bring me any joy to talk about a medium that I know I was part of helping shape when I look at the fact that there are mass violence campaigns, there are organized harassment campaigns going on around the world that social media is helping enable. No, it doesn't cause them. I'm not being that reductive. But it does amplify them. It does exacerbate them. And there's very little accountability. The people feeling that pain are not the people who are profiting to the tunes of billions of dollars from these platforms. And so by a few years ago, honestly, I'd given up. You've heard a lot of stories about Silicon Valley and about being in the heart of the industry. I was there, and I left. I went back home to New York, and I thought I would never be in tech, actually, again. I thought I would never be at a startup again. I certainly didn't think I would be CEO of a company that was calling itself a startup ever again. But some things changed. I actually got back in touch. I had reach out one of those people I'd met in the early days of social media, Joel Spolsky, and he'd built a company that had built really a number of really successful products. They had spun out Stack Overflow, one of the most popular community for coders in the world. They had built Trello, which is like a project management tool. And all of those still felt like they were part of that old-fashioned way of working. Like you knew how they worked, and the information on them was true, and you paid them money, and they gave you a service. I mean, it's old-fashioned, but it seemed like, wow, that might be one way to build a business. And he told me about the next thing they were building, and asked if I would come help build it. And that was Glitch. That's the company where I am now. And what the idea was very simple. It returned to the idea that the web that we all spend our time on should be made by people, and that each of us could be people that create that web. And that when we look at our phone, if you look at the apps on your phone, how many of them do you know who made them? How many of them do you know what the values are of the people who did make them? In contrast to, say, what you eat. Now, sometimes we all have our guilty pleasures. We have factory farm fast food that we eat. Like I was in the airport on the way here, and yeah, I'm not always being disciplined as I should be. But think about what you remember in your life. And these are the meals you cooked at home with people you love, surrounded by people maybe from your community or who know your cultural tradition. Maybe you know where the ingredients were from. You read the little label about what farm it was from. And think about that as an analogy to your digital diet. How many apps are locally grown, made by somebody you love? How much time do you spend online on a site made by somebody who gives a damn about you and is not trying to extract data from you? That is not a wild question to ask. That was the norm. Tens of millions of people were creating on these sites just a few years ago. This isn't science fiction. This is a known behavior. And that desire for us to create what we see in front of us did not go away. It just got distracted for a little while. And I realized that was true because as I joined Glitch, I saw what the team had done to build a friendly community, saying we are not going to allow hate speech here. We are not going to allow organized misinformation here. We are not going to allow targeted harassment campaigns here. Simple rules, same rules we have in this room. Nobody's worried about what happened if somebody came in here shouting slurs at me. We'd be like, I don't think you're welcome. Real simple. This is not wild-eyed fantasy. It's just basic human skills. Put those same skills to work in an online community, and you get amazing things like what Noelle Lee built. Noelle built a very simple app. Since she identifies as a trans person, she wanted to be able to represent herself accurately during Trans Visibility Day. It made a simple tool to be able to put the trans pride flag on her avatar on social media. And the amazing thing that happened was that others picked it up and ran with it. Rather than saying, well, what about me? What about my identity? You didn't think about me. People could take that app and remix it and make one for bi visibility, for lesbian visibility, for whatever their identity was, And all of those were created by people who are saying, I want to see myself online too. And to me, even though she never knew Brad Graham, it felt like an echo of those early days of social media, of seeing people saying, I want to be visible, and I want to be represented, and I'm going to build what it takes for me to be seen here. Similarly, Bertani Thurston is a comedian and an activist and entertainer in New York, where I live, and he built an app called Living While Black. And it's both funny and disturbing in the way that only he can be, which was that he wanted to give a glimpse into what it is to be a black man living in America through the lens of headlines in the news. And what the app does is it shows you a headline about whether somebody got the cops called on them for doing an ordinary activity in American life, like running a lemonade stand, or going to a grocery store, or walking down the street. And you have to decide if that's a real headline or not. And the fact that it's so challenging to decide that really drives home how both funny and cringe-inducingly awful this reality is. And it felt to me exactly like the same kind of provocative challenge that Aaron had placed with Uppity Negro as his site a decade earlier. There were echoes of these same ideas carrying through, even again, amongst people who'd never met. And then I think about Monica Dinculescu. And she's an incredibly talented engineer. She works at Google and stuff that I don't fully understand because I'm not that good a programmer anymore. And in her free time, she built a really simple, goofy thing called an emoji garden. And you put like the bunny emoji and a grass emoji and maybe a flower, and you can make a little Zen garden for yourself out of emoji and share it with people. It just feels good. It's nice. And then the community took it and remixed their own versions. So somebody made a seashore one, and it's got sand and waves and the little crab emoji, and it's very cute. And then somebody made the goth one, and it's got like cemeteries in it, and tombstones, and bats. And if you have a dark soul, that's a good one for you. But the sense that was really amazing to me was she didn't prompt anybody and say, you should go do this. There's no prize. There's no engagement metrics tied around it. It is just the honest impulse people have to see what somebody's created and respond with their own creation and connect around the idea that we're going to share fun, beautiful things together in the same way that people would take poetry they saw from Leslie Harpold 20 years ago and want to respond with their own poetry. So the amazing thing is that these people took these ideas and built projects together just because they had the tools to do so. Didn't have to convince anybody, didn't have to cajole anybody, didn't have to bribe anybody. Didn't have to keep a streak going. All you had to do was say, I want to give you the creative tools to put in front of others the thing that lets you show yourself and your ideas to the world. And here's the amazing thing. Millions of people have picked up this torch and carried it forward. This week we announced that people on Glitch, just on the Glitch community alone, have built 2.5 million of these apps and projects on Glitch. That is more than Apple's App Store. That is more than Google's Play Store. And all of these, thank you, all of these are open, they're remixable, you can view source like we used to do back in the day, copying and pasting things out of our browser. They are meant for people to create with. And it's everything from what people use at work, where they're making a little Slack bot for their work, to goofy things like emoji gardens, to activism around traffic safety, around gun violence, around every issue you can imagine. They're all in there together creating. And it's entirely possible. We also were able to announce that we were doing our company our way. So while we built the team for Glitch, we doubled in size in about 3 months, from December of last year to March of this year. And we did so while improving on every vector of inclusion on the team. The majority of our team are women and non-binary people, including in management. We're proportional in representation and race. We have 30% of our team that identify as LGBTQ. And we're working to improve all of those numbers. These are things that Silicon Valley says are too hard, too impossible, but meanwhile, they're planning how they're going to land rocket ships on the moon and bring them back. I think it is easier to do these things, to invite everybody into the room, than it is to imagine self-driving cars are going to take over every city in the world. And the reason it matters that we had all of these people in the room is this is the reason why we can build a community at the scale of millions of people and millions of apps without all of the harms and all of the harassment and all of the dangers. We have a team that understands exactly why it's our imperative to do so. So, I appreciate getting your time today. And what I wanted to impress upon you all is this is our success and one company and one community and one sort of, well, old-fashioned idea. But it is an ethos that is not limited to any of us. And I hope as you hear so much inspiration today about how to be a successful company and how to be a successful entrepreneur and how to build a startup that works, we think about making communities and platforms that enable everybody to own their work, to create together, to ensure a healthy environment, to include everybody while they do it, and to not ever, ever, ever believe anybody who says any of those things are too hard to do. Thank you so much.